Um, there was a lot of manufacturing going on, not only in the 40 years prior to the war. This is part of the economic, socio-economic uniqueness of the state of Maryland. But in the 40 years prior to the war, um, Baltimore City and County grew fantastically well because of industry. And
Real quick, Nikki, this document is in your packet. The one with the first page says class 2. It's the last page of that.
We got it.
okay. And I just wanted you to have this because it's important that to see clearly that Western Maryland, Frederick County, Acre County, all these cities were growing fantastically in terms of energy. They were still doing very well, in agriculture, but there was a mix. That whole part of the state was now a mixture of industry and agriculture. And why? Because of the B&O Railroad. The railroad allowed that whole section of the state to make its products and ship them to Baltimore, either for Baltimore itself or for the port of Baltimore to be shipped anywhere else in the world.
Did it come down here? Did the B&O come down here? The B&O Railroad come out here?
No,
Just Baltimore.
right. It went to Baltimore and south, largely into Washington D.C.
Not out.
But then went to the relay station, 7 miles south of Baltimore, and then off west toward Harper's Ferry and up to Potomac all the way eventually. And they started about 1839, 1835 with the first horse-drawn railroad, the first real serviceable daily railroad in the country was between Baltimore and Ellicott City. The Ellicott City station, have you ever been there? I mean, it's really a cool little museum. Yes, it really is, because it was horse-drawn cars that were pulling one car, one railroad car along tracks. I don't know how quite they did it, but they did. So it was slow, and fortunately, it wasn't too hilly for the horses. But then people like Ross Wymans, who he was the chief engineer for the B&O Railroad for a long time, started with a small steam engine. And it pulled the railroad car slowly, but they didn't need horses anymore. And then other northern machinists were started to end up in New England, even started with working for the Pennsylvania Railroad in Philadelphia. They built the tracks between Boston and Philadelphia and Washington, Baltimore, just Baltimore, not Washington. Because that's why they had to switch. They had to switch to the B&O to get to Washington. But there was rail service basically between Boston and Washington. Yes.
So when they put the track in, were they doing that with the thought at some point in the future they were going to be mechanized, or did they think it was just going to be the horses?
I don't think I don't know. That's a good question. But they had to have thought they could have. They must have understood that somewhere in Europe, I think in England, they had the first steam engine. So they were stealing ideas from England. And then, there were people going back and forth who saw all these things happening, and they applied it to this country. And so when the first steam engine started, I can't tell you exactly where exactly it started, but in this country, it was Ross Wymans who was the first to create the first small steam engine. They were literally small.
The B&O had its own thumb that raced the horse,
Right.
and the horse won.
The other thing is that if you haven't been to the C&O, that's not C&O, the B&O Museum in Baltimore, it's a big roundhouse. It is fascinating because it has the whole history. It has the original little engine, and then it has the bigger and bigger and more powerful engines that eventually, between 1838, 1839, and 1853, built this railroad that went all the way out to Wheeling, West Virginia, on the Ohio River. And that opened up Baltimore, port of Baltimore, city of Baltimore, to many of the wheat farmers and grain farmers from Ohio and Indiana. They could ship their material up or down the Ohio to Wheeling and load them on the train and have them in Baltimore within a couple of days. And so this shocked us. That's why Baltimore kept growing. And Baltimore had an amazingly diverse industry. And so I say this to reinforce the importance of Baltimore and the fact that Baltimore was changing the entire economy of the state of Maryland, which theretofore was strictly agricultural. It was, on the southwestern three counties was St. Mary's and Calvert, which included Montgomery and Anne Arundel, Prince George's, and
Charles.
Charles. And so that was strictly tobacco. Even in 1860, that was largely tobacco. By 1860, the Eastern Shore counties were largely changing because of the price of tobacco was not worth growing it anymore. What they realized was since Baltimore was growing, they could grow food crops, etc., grain crops out here, and ship them to Baltimore and make much more money and not need slaves. And so that was changing the environment. Well, why was that changing? It was because of the growth of Baltimore. Also, politically, it was changing the legislature. Baltimore had become the fourth largest city in America, had grown pretty well. And as a result, many of the people, the 212,000 people who lived in Baltimore in 1860, they weren't like the farmers, the old line farmers, the people who were tied to the land, so to speak, like their Virginia brethren and like many other Southerners. There was no place like in the South, anyway, in the slave states, like Baltimore. The only thing close to that was New Orleans. But New Orleans was a large city simply because it was a port city moving cotton. There was no industry in New Orleans, and no big railroad there. And so as a result, Baltimore was a unique place. Now, for the legislature, they weren't so crazy about these changes because the Baltimore city and county hardly reflected the values of slave owners, which there were still plenty of in the state of Maryland. But these changes, especially on the Eastern Shore and in the northwestern part of the state, slaves were being manumitted regularly, and that was becoming a problem for the slave owning part of the population. And those other poorer whites who relied on not having to compete with African Americans for jobs on the farms and in the small towns. And as a result, there was tension. Plus, the city was a large city, and there was violence. And I think we talked about this some last time, but essentially, it was a big, larger and larger city with lots of competition for good jobs in the port and in the industry and in all aspects of non-farming Baltimoreans. And with the influx of thousands of immigrants from mostly Germany and Ireland, there was a strong competition and violence between the nativists, who became the know-nothings, and the immigrants, who were oftentimes, Whigs, and they didn't reflect the values of the Democratic Party, which was mostly the farmers and slave owners and the more traditional old line Maryland. And that was getting to be a big problem. So here we are, Oh, so I just want you to see this. Uh, I didn't go into, breaking down the counties by what section that they're in, but it becomes obvious that where there was virtually no growth, if you look at this along with that other chart from last week, with just the population, you'll see that most of the farming counties weren't growing over the 40 years prior to 1860. Well, I mean, Talbot County grew by not even 100 people, I think. And then most of the other, southwestern shore, south and southern counties, those populations weren't growing. They were just stable. They were just hanging in there. But the rest of the state was growing like topsy. And that was great on one hand for the state and for the larger enterprises, but not for the slave-only farmers and the old line politics of the state of Maryland. So here we are basically now in 1860, 1861, and these two forces are starting to come together to clash because there is a confrontation going on between the new party, the new Republican Party, which won a national election then, and a Republican was now president, who received practically no support in the state of Maryland, which was always a middle ground. But it certainly had no support, the Democratic Party, which was basically the old line party in the state, barely could secure half the voters in the state because so many of the growing population were just not tuned to what their priorities were. So this is what happens. Now we're going to get to, we talked last week about everything prior to violence, prior to firing on Fort Sumter. That's where I wanted to start today. We got almost to Fort Sumter last week, I think, but now we're going to talk about it because I've heard it said that the Fort Sumter issue was just a hiccup. Nobody was killed. But so the South fired on Fort Sumter, but nobody was killed. So, what difference does that make? Well, it made a big difference in the North. I think a lot of people decided that the flag was fired upon, and that was an act of war. It was an act of armed rebellion. It was a revolution. Robert E. Lee was famous prior to the war to have written a letter to his son Custis and said, secession is nothing but revolution. He knew. And that was at the point where they were just talking. Once the new Southern government decided to take up arms and fire on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, then it was an armed revolution against the United States government and all the requirements of staying within the government. So they were clearly looking to move. And we talked about why. And the reason why is they only had 7 seceded states. And they were not the most populous states. The most populous states, 2 most populous states were Virginia and North Carolina in that order. So the South could hardly survive as a new country without more states, especially the 2 most populous states. And states like Maryland, which were economically huge economic engines that the South knew it would need, because it's essentially, doing cotton makes it sort of a banana republic. Of course, they certainly still grew rice and sugar, and that was good money making. But it was all about King Cotton, as Senator Hammond made his famous Cotton is King speech in 1860, 59 in the Senate. So this was a war. This was war. I mean, in the North, it was unmistakable. when a couple of days after Fort Sumter, the small garrison of 70 men were left Charleston, came back, and they landed in New York. And there were 100,000 New Yorkers there to greet them at Union Square. People were ready to go. In fact, we talked, I think, a little bit in the past, at least the last time, about how quickly Northern governors and Northern militia came to arms. Benjamin Butler was a good example of it. He was a prosperous attorney and cotton manufacturer. He owned cotton mills in Lawrence, Massachusetts, right in that north of Boston area. And within a few days after Fort Sumter, as soon as Lincoln called out the 75,000 troops, he, he was involved in the militia in a regiment, got charge of the regiment, and they were on the train from Boston to New York to Philadelphia within a few days of Fort Sumter. That's how these troops got down to Baltimore. When you look at it, Fort Sumter was April 12th, and this was April 19th. This is a week later. These people left their lives, their jobs, and got to answer the call. The governors of the states called for troops. These people responded instantly. They were highly motivated people. They weren't trained soldiers by any means, but they were highly motivated people. And they were from New York. They were from Massachusetts. They were from Connecticut, Pennsylvania. Some were a little quicker than others. New York and Massachusetts were the two fastest, and that's why they got into the scene, because they understood that Lincoln and the government was defenseless in Washington, D.C. Yes.
Isn't it true that a lot of money people paid to represent them in the conflict? There were a lot of Irish that came down to Savannah. I know that they were paid by New Yorkers to fight for them in the war.
Oh,
Well, you're talking about people coming to answer the call for combat, right?
right.
Well, didn't a lot of people with money pay people to pay these new immigrants?
Later, you could pay somebody to take your spot in the draw.
Oh, that was, oh, yeah, I mean.
That was later?
This was just, that was after, we'll get to that at some point.
Okay.
Actually, no, we won't, but basically,
Oh,
the South needed to start conscription in the spring of 1862. The Union started conscription in the summer of 1863. The volunteerism that was so rife at the very beginning, where nobody really understood what they were getting into. Everybody said, "Oh, I'll drink to that. Let's go off to war." Well, after a year or so, all those volunteers from the previous year was saying, "Okay, my year is up." And there was nothing that the Confederate government could do. And they tried all kinds of incentives, but there was nothing they could do to keep those men. They were headed home. Most of them did, until, of course, they passed the conscription law. And then all those volunteers were no longer volunteers, they were conscripts. And they knew it. And they didn't like it. So from that moment on, the Confederate side had serious desertion, French leave, call it what you want. But they suffered from it. Eventually, it caught up with them, and they could no longer keep strong enough armies in the field. It took another whole year for the North, but the North had so many other resources and so many people that it didn't nearly affect them as much. And they knew by 1864, they knew they were winning. And so, for example, after Lincoln's re-election in 1864, the vast majority of the army of the Western Army, Sherman's army, the vast majority of their enlistments was coming due before the end of the year. But the vast majority re-enlisted at that point because they knew they were winning and they wanted to finish off the war. And that the pride that they had in the mission that they were in. And that mission was now not only defeating the South, but it was emancipating the final abolition of slavery. And that was a bitter pill in late 1862 when Lincoln talked about the preliminary emancipation, and then even worse when the Emancipation Proclamation hit. But part of the Union's ability to deal with white people who didn't want to fight was to recruit African Americans who did want to fight for their own freedom. And that's a big part of how, the total number, there was like about 200,000 blacks who fought in the Union Army and Navy during the war. The other thing that goes swept under the rug is that, according to a book called The South versus the South by William Freely, there were 300,000 white men from enslaved states who fought in the Union armies during the war. Now that includes Maryland, that includes Kentucky, slave state, that includes Missouri, slave state. Mostly white men fought for the Union in those states, especially including Maryland. But also that included the Appalachian South, where slavery was unimportant to most people, and they felt like they were being dragged into the war by the South. When the South coerced the Middle South into joining the Confederacy by firing on Fort Sumter, creating the need for Lincoln to call for 75,000 troops to defend the Union, that created coercion for these poor white people who had nothing to do with slavery. And so as a result, the eastern portion of Tennessee, the eastern third of Tennessee, was virtually all Union. It was a Union stronghold. 40,000 men from eastern Tennessee fought for the Union. The same with, I lived in Georgia for 10 years and was unaware that early on that there were thousands of people in northwest Georgia and northeastern Alabama who would never support the Confederacy, never did, and refused to join the Confederacy. Even after conscription, they got themselves, Governor Joe Brown basically had to give them the opportunity to enlist, but only to fight in the state of Georgia, to defend the state of Georgia. They wouldn't cross any borders to defend the rest of the Confederacy. That's how intensely they were against the Confederate concept of not of independence, but of having to fight a war that they knew was for slavery. Remember, the South had, the Confederate government opened fire on Fort Sumter, and their goal was to protect slavery, because they talked about briefly the only difference in the U.S. Constitution and the Confederate Constitution was the permanent establishment of slavery without any question, plus the line item veto for the president and 1 6-year term for the president. Those are the differences between the U.S. Constitution and the Confederate Constitution. So don't think for a minute that whole thing wasn't about preserving and, more importantly, growing slavery, because Lincoln in his campaign made it abundantly clear that he was not, his objective and the Republican Party's objective was not to abolish slavery where it existed. It was protected by the Constitution. Their goal was to limit the growth of slavery out in the Western Territory. And the lords of the South, the planter class, understood that for slavery to succeed, to remain viable, it needed to continually grow. And as it had been growing from the easternmost South Carolina, the East Coast, the original 13, the southern colonies, out to what was becoming, Alabama, Mississippi. Those places were growing very quickly because of the Mississippi River and that whole system of irrigation of cotton fields. And it had been extended to Texas, and these guys saw their way not only to grow cotton, California, et cetera, but also by 1849, there was the gold rush. And they could just practically count them, their money by having their slaves go dig out gold, in California. And white people in the north and in the Midwest were saying, no, we're not going to compete with slave labor to succeed. And in effect, in a microcosm of that, Baltimore, white Baltimore labor, white Frederick laborers, that class of people were not going to compete with slaves. They would compete with free blacks, which they did in Baltimore. 25,000 free blacks. They were competing with those people for jobs, and they did it peacefully. They fought with each other. The white immigrants fought the white nativists, but they didn't really fight the black laborers in Baltimore. So that was the conundrum that was bothering and annoying, and making it difficult for Maryland to secede. And in fact, I believe it had everything to do with Maryland not seceding. That plus the realistic assumption of understanding that, especially after the Baltimore riot, the Northerners were very upset with Maryland. Baltimore and Maryland would have been, if Maryland had seceded, as the secessionists were trying to do, the retribution by abandoning the city of Washington at that crucial time, it would have made Maryland not only the battlefield that Governor Hicks and Bradford and others were trying to avoid, but it would have absolutely destroyed the entire core business infrastructure and the economies of virtually the entire economy, where it probably would have been worse than what happened to Virginia, which was one of the main battlefields, of the war, and did suffer brutally, as a result of having seceded when they did. Not only that, but not only did Virginia suffer, but it also lost 33 counties at the beginning of the war because 33 Western Virginia counties would have seceded. That's how badly the Virginia's tidewater planter class injured their own state. They were pretty darn irresponsible because even we understood that the border states would be manipulated by the Deep South to become the battle. They knew it. They talked about it. I didn't make copies of it, but I could, believe me, I can find it and show you. And so that was the basis of what was happening under the table, so to speak, because of the soaring rhetoric of men like Severn Teagle Wallace and T. Parkin Scott in Baltimore and other major secessionist leaders spoke to our future is with the Cavaliers of Virginia and that's our heritage, et cetera, et cetera. But the reality was different, and we'll talk about it because some of the Baltimore business leaders addressed it, and I think impacted the legislature at the end when it was time for the legislature to actually make a decision on secession. Okay, so let's get to the Baltimore riots. Always a fun discussion. What was happening in that the slave states were refusing to see firing on Fort Sumter as coercion or aggression, but they certainly took complete offense to Lincoln calling for 75,000 troops to defend the United States and the United States Constitution. So right away, Lincoln was the aggressor. he was coercing the South. The government's reaction was to defend Washington, but as it was for the time in March that Lincoln took over as president and the firing on Fort Sumter, he refused to do anything aggressively against the South. He was coordinating with Southern Unionists in most states and promising that no, we're not going to attack the South. We'll defend the Union, but we're not going to attack the South. Meanwhile, Jefferson Davis and his government still couldn't get the other 8 slave states to secede from the Union. They all wanted to secede before they seceded and left the U.S. Constitution because they felt properly that slavery was protected within the U.S. Constitution. And until Lincoln did anything militarily against them, that they were safer within the Union. And they all appreciated the Union to one extent or other, even though they all had their diehard secessions, don't get me wrong. So, the Fort Sumter changed everything. And so right away, the Middle South, Tennessee, North Carolina, Arkansas, and you would also have to think Virginia was largely considered Middle South. They moved and understood Lincoln's call for troops as coercion of the South. And they were right to do that. They had stronger secessionist views. They were largely the further south you went, the more they depended on cotton. And the more they needed to feel like they had to defend the future of slavery. It's relatively simple. So when it came time for Baltimore to join the South, we all know that the Governor Hicks was fairly well a Unionist, but he was not very a strong Unionist by any stretch of the imagination. As a matter of fact, if he had his own druthers, there would have been a Middle States Confederacy that protected slavery, but would try to maintain the peace and not allow for a war to begin. That would have disappeared once Fort Sumter happened. But on the other hand, that's where the Unionism stood in the state of Maryland prior to Fort Sumter. But in Baltimore, it was the center of activities, in political activities in the state of Maryland. As a result, a lot of the newspapers were there, the media, everything was centered in Baltimore. And as a result, once the idea started getting into people's heads that in order for Washington and in order for Lincoln to be able to maintain the Union, he had to defend Washington. In order for the Union to defend Washington, they had to come through Maryland largely to get to Washington to arm it. So the secessionists understood that, and they were going to do everything they could to block it. That's what happened. April 19th was the riot, but on April 17th, word started to get in and filter in that troops were starting coming from Pennsylvania, through Philadelphia and through Harrisburg to the three different main train stations in Baltimore. The Bolton Street Station, President Street Station, and the Camden Street Station. The Bolton came from Harrisburg. That came to the north part of town. The President Street was right off of Pratt Street, on a few yards away. And Camden Station was down the other end of Pratt Street, and about a mile away from, at least a mile away from the other two. But on April 17th, once this news was going on, that's when the secessionists started to act up. On the 18th, once that happened, the 18th brought news of Virginia's secession vote. On the April 18th, or April 17th, the Virginia legislature voted to secede. That was an electric shock because so many Marylanders felt that their fate was with Virginia. Whatever Virginia did, Maryland did, because their ties right across the Potomac River forever. There was so much continuity between the two states that, at least on that portion of the state, that it seemed like one almost had to do what the other did. And Maryland couldn't make a move to the Confederacy without Virginia, because they would have no. If Maryland seceded and Virginia didn't secede, where would Maryland be? That would just be plain old stupid. They all knew that. So when the news of Virginia finally seceded came in, that was astounding. Remember, on April 4th, Virginia voted not to secede by a 2-1 margin in the legislature. April 4th, this was April 19th. So Fort Sumter came in the middle, and that changed everything. It changed everything for Virginia because it pushed, it pushed the voices of the Tidewater planters into a much more powerful position, even though it didn't budge those 33 counties in Western Virginia that basically refused to secede. And so here you have Maryland, much smaller state, with a different socioeconomic economy, that the secessionists didn't particularly see a difference. They just were going to go with Virginia and go with the Confederacy. They were happy to do that. One of the leaders was T. Parkin Scott. He was aware that units from northern states were on the way to Washington, and he exhorted his listeners to take action. It wasn't easy, it wasn't difficult, I should say, to get people excited in Baltimore. Baltimore was a mob town. There were mobs, and what happened in Baltimore was they knew. As a matter of fact, it really wasn't even but the biggest riot that they've had. They had bigger riots over mayor elections in previous years. 1854, 1856, 1858. There was rioting and gang violence, throughout Baltimore on a regular basis. So here we are, and here are some of Baltimore, Maryland's leading secessionists in Baltimore, exciting crowds, inviting them to public meetings, and riling them up. And that's essentially what they did. There's a book called Dissonance by David Setzer, and he did a lot of research on who was in the mob, and actually it wasn't really the poor working class. It was, according to his research, it was the merchants, clerks, and others in commercial pursuits. But basically, they were secessionists, and secessionists were largely controlling Baltimore politics. One of the interesting things I learned preparing for this class, or relearned that I forgot that I previously knew it that happened, was that because of the violence, when the Democrats took control of the legislature in 1860 with that election, they arbitrarily removed the 5 delegates who were elected from Baltimore City, and replaced them with 5 of their people, secessionist types. They also took the police commissioner and replaced him with a commission of 5 members of the police commission, all of whom, one of them was the editor of one of the secessionist newspapers. And basically it was mostly secessionists who were in charge of the police. And they appointed Marshall King, who was himself a secessionist. Now, between the time he was appointed and the time the riot, he was doing a lot to quell the violent aspects of day-to-day life in Baltimore. But when it came to quelling the possibility of a secessionist rally in Baltimore, he did everything he could to enhance it, to allow it, promote it. And I think it's fair to say that. Why? Here's why. Because he had or maybe something that I didn't know exactly, I kind of felt it, but there was a police force in Baltimore of 698 men. That's a pretty big police force. So it was a pretty big city. It was more than 12,000 people. But on the day of the riot, 40 men were on. Now the rest of them, they might have been in the bomb. That's my view. There's no evidence that says most of those police were the white guy. That's my view. I believe that. Because the other point that I would make, think about this, only 40 men are, on duty. Marshal King absolutely, and the police board absolutely knew that Union troops were coming. They were probably there listening to the secessionist speeches the day before. On the 18th, a small group of unarmed Pennsylvania troops actually went through the city, changed trains, got to Camden Yard Station and came south and entered Washington. Few companies, not even the Redwood, maybe 400 or 500 men. But they were confronted, but it was not a riot. But later, they knew again that more troops were coming the next day, and this time they were going to be ready. And so, what does Marshal King do to prepare for this? He takes he leaves 650 men off duty, and he takes his 40 men and he brings them to the station, to Camden Station. Why? He did that to protect the property for the B&O Railroad, allegedly. What he didn't do was take them to the President Street Station where all those men were coming in and where he very likely knew the mob was going to be. And so, how could he not know that he knew that the trains from Harrisburg and New York came to President Street Station and Bolton Station? He knew they didn't come to Camden. So if he had intended to protect the troops, he'd have gone to where they were going to arrive. And if he had any sense, he would have had at least some police officer there, to at least tell him that troops had arrived and there was a large mob. He would have ridden his horse over to Camden Street Station 1 mile away, and a lot of good things probably would have happened. You're trying to promote the riot and trying to defend Baltimore against these, Huns, Pennsylvania, New York, and Massachusetts. That's what I would do. I make your own thoughts about it. Read some of the stuff that is in the handout, and you make your own decision. I can't believe that was a mistake. As a result, and oddly enough, and this is the interesting thing, they knew that the trains were going to arrive sometime late morning, unless there were delays, but they expected late morning arrival. Arrival came at 11 a.m. And as a result, men got off the train and got onto the horse-drawn cars that led across Pratt Street. There were about 1,100 men, about 700 were from the Massachusetts regiment, and the others were from Pennsylvania. The Massachusetts men got off first, and the first, there were like 8 companies in the regiment. The first 5 companies made it across Pratt Street in the horse-drawn cars. There was shouting and yelling at them. I guess some bricks thrown, but no guns. wasn't a full-blown riot. What happened was that the last three companies were separated because rioters started throwing sand and anchors on the tracks. And so the last 200 or 250 men were stranded, and they couldn't sit in the cars while the horses drew the 1 mile from President Street Station to Camden Station, and they became the focus of the riot. They were just basically going through to defend themselves, and the crowds gathered momentum, and assaulted them to the point where men were getting hit with brick bats. I finally looked up what brick bat is. It's just a brick, not a baseball bat. But the point is that they were accosted. There were 250 of them or so, 200, 250, and they fired in self-defense, killed 4 people, or 12 people or something like that, and 4 of them were killed. Others, many more were hurt, injured. And that was the sum total of the deaths. But, and here's the interesting, and I just learned this too. The whole Baltimore riot started at 11 a.m. It was over at 1 p.m. Because at 1 p.m., all of the Massachusetts troops were on the train at the Camden Yard and were leaving town. 1 p.m. So that was a 2-hour riot. But it got such play in the press and on, north and south. The northern reaction throughout the north was vehemence. And in the south, it was great hope, excitement, exhilaration, to the extent that Jefferson Davis told the governor Letcher of Virginia, support the defense of Maryland, support the defense of. It wrote to his militia contacts, come to Baltimore, blood in the streets. We'd have to defend the city of Baltimore against these bombs, what are even called. But the point is that that's what happened. And the riot, the 2-hour riot, with 200 men being assaulted by, I don't know. And that's one thing I still haven't been able to get a grip on, is how many people were actually rioting. There are estimates, I've seen estimates of 300, 400 to 8,000, 9,000. It's insane. There are people on rooftops allegedly participating in this along Pratt Street. And, I don't know. But I can't imagine that in a 2-hour riot, there could have been more than a couple of thousand people who participated in defending Baltimore against these abolitionists from Massachusetts. Interestingly, the regiment from Pennsylvania didn't even try to make the crossing. They got back in the train and later on quietly went back to Pennsylvania over, and they didn't do it easily, but they made it. They weren't involved in violence. They left when it went back. Yes.
Were those troops armed? Were they armed once you came from the north?
Massachusetts guys were. Yeah, and they were told, they knew that there would be violence. They expected violence. So the regimental commander and each of the company commanders had their troops load their rifles for the trip across Baltimore. And so, they were, to that extent, they were prepared. They were basically just defending themselves. And so their men started getting hurt, seriously hurt. And so they fired in self-defense. Hard to believe that, shoot. I mean, I don't know, those guys weren't dressed in gray uniforms as Confederate soldiers. they were shooting at them, they were throwing bricks right under the building, so they defended themselves. And so, interestingly, the riot was probably, I wouldn't say what do they call it these days, a nothing burger. It was important because there was a substantial element of secessionism in Baltimore and throughout the state of Maryland. In fact, one of the militia groups that responded to Marshal Kane and immediately took the train to Baltimore to defend Baltimore was the militia group from Frederick, Maryland. Allegedly, Yankee country. Well, not really. I mean, it was a reflection that there was, a tremendous split in North and South, secessionism and unionism throughout the state. But, and it happened so fast after Fort Sumter that people didn't really have a lot of time to think things through. And as a result, emotions were let go. And so there was this, terrible violence in Baltimore.
And when you think of it back then, the communication levels
Right.
were next to nothing.
Although,
No television or radio.
exactly. We didn't have CNN. I didn't have CNN. But the point is that telegraph was making a big difference. Telegraph was the secret weapon, so to speak, because the people on the railroad managers, they had telegraph service. They would tell on a day-to-day basis. Philadelphia would tell Baltimore that train X is on the way.
Right.
So they all knew who was coming and who wasn't. They had their schedules.
Yeah.
So there was no question that Baltimore knew what was coming
Right.
and approximately when it would get there. And it did happen that way. So nobody could play stupid or dumb when it comes to knowing. And I don't think that Marshall Kane could play dumb and not know that the trains arriving from the north were going to be not coming to Camden Station. I think that's fair to say. So the aftermath, Baltimore. The aftermath is that as soon as the fighting was over, people like Marshall Kane and others connected with their secessionist friends to get more people, more Marylanders to come to defend Baltimore from the Union invasion. Some people were taking this invasion as an invasion of against all Marylanders, like attacking Marylanders, not being attacked by Marylanders. For example, and we'll get this next week, the Eastern Shore. General Tillman basically wrote to the militia out here in Talbot and to Queen Anne's, and he was only last week in
Caroline.
Caroline. Thank you. I'm going to have to make a sign. We have to repel these invaders in our state, basically declaring Talbot and his area of Maryland to have seceded. And we'll go into the details of that. I was going to try to do it today, but I'm unhappy with the quality of the copies that I made. So it's almost illegible. And I want you to be able to read the resolutions that took place in his order and the resolutions that came out of the Talbot County meeting that basically declared Talbot County for the South. But that's another story for next week. But it was follow-up. And so basically more Southern militia, including a group from Talbot County. When the news of the Baltimore riot finally arrived in Talbot County, there was a wealthy North Carolinian who happened to be visiting here, who decided to sponsor and pay for a steamship to go across to Baltimore to reinforce the men. And so many of the people who were, the secessionists who were in the militia jumped on that steamer and went to Baltimore to defend Baltimore. Now, they came back a few days later, a couple of days later, and nothing happened. Nothing happened. Riot. There was a lot of walking and talking and showing their blue cockades and waving Maryland flags and taking their U.S. flags down because that was just the mood at the moment. The secessionists were in the streets. The Unionists were not. I mean, it's really that simple. And as a result, there was a large feeling of that Maryland was, ready to go, ready to secede along with Virginia. Trina, time.
Oh, you're 2:27, so you got 33 minutes.
Okay. All right. So they were, the secessionists here were working, and importantly, the secessionists were also working with Confederates, because, like I mentioned earlier, Jefferson Davis was telling the governor of Virginia to help out, help them on, and weapons were already being shipped and had been shipped right at the next day, within 2 days. 2,000 to 5,000 rifles were shipped to Baltimore, and signed off by the police authority, the police department. They didn't send it to the state of Maryland. They didn't send it to the governor. They sent it to the police board, because the police board were the secessionists. I'm not even sure the governor knew about it. But that's how the Confederates were doing everything that they could to support this insurrection in Baltimore, to set it up for the legislature to declare for secession. That was the plan. And T. Parkin Scott, it wasn't Scott, it was, I think, Severn Eagle, those two. Public announcement, because they were after the governor to call for a secession convention of the legislature to talk about it. And they have been doing that ever since the beginning of the year, beginning of 1861. Secessionists wanted to get this going. As a result of this true secessionists actually calling for a convention over and above any authority by the governor. The governor knew at that point there was going to be a convention, and I might as well take charge of it, take responsibility for it, which he did. But he didn't put it in Baltimore. And he didn't put it in Annapolis, because at the very time, the day or two after the riots, who was landing in Annapolis? Benjamin Butler. And these things are happening by the hour. It's almost like I have to watch CNN to keep up with the breaking news. But the point is that Butler was landing in Annapolis, and the first units of troops, of Union troops, after the ones that came through in Baltimore, they weren't going to come through. Lincoln gave the word to the governor and to others that we won't push people through Baltimore. And so you started using ferry boats. They started using steamships to take units, not even stop, not even take the train down to Perryville on the Susquehanna River, which is what Benjamin Butler did with his 8th Massachusetts. But and so they started, coming down to Annapolis. On the other hand, Butler was the first to get to Annapolis, and some secessionists had torn up some of the Annapolis-Elkridge spur. See, the B&O Railroad had built their tracks, down to Relay, at Relay Station. they had two wings, basically the wing that went south and west toward Annapolis, and the wing that went north and east to Harper's Ferry and eventually out to western Maryland and to Wheeling, West Virginia. A lot of that through Virginia, state of Virginia, which was another story. But the point is that the response was to get as many arms and Confederate types, secessionists, into Baltimore and use, the important thing here is to use relay stations. So the point is, and nobody really could see this because everything was happening so fast. Somehow, I guess, it was a necessity for the Union troops under Burnside to get and secure the track between Annapolis and Relay Station, which is 7 miles south of Baltimore. Pretty close. Before, and secure that before the secessionists split. So they arrived, and within a day or two, and oddly enough, they had a locomotive in the yard in Annapolis, and it was being taken down literally as the Yankees had arrived. They were dismantling the locomotive. And the really weird part of that is that one of the men, or several of the men in the 8th Massachusetts, literally built that locomotive up in Massachusetts. So they asked, who does anybody know how to work, how to do this? And the guy said, yeah, that was all right, we built that damn thing. And so they quickly got it back to work, operational, and they moved it out of the yard, and they started moving up north, right through where General's Highway is. They went right past where the Annapolis Mall is, into Millersville and upwards, upwards of Millersville, across where Route 3 is now today, and got up to Relay Station, which was not too far from Ellicott City, but and secured that within a day or two, to the point where not only did Burnside's regiment and the 7th New York Regiment, they went up there together to control, because they had heard all kinds of, stories about Confederates being up there in big numbers, secessionists from Maryland being up there in big numbers to oppose them. There weren't. So they found the tracks that were torn up and they put it together. And in 2 days, they got to Relay Station. And there was enough communication with Washington that Washington sent a train up from D.C. up to Relay Station to take those first troops and get them into Washington. So on the 27th, the first true armed reinforcements finally started arriving in Washington, which was a city that was completely fearful and totally paranoid, and scared to death because it was so totally vulnerable. There were only a couple of hundred, maybe up to 2,000 troops, none of which were really trained troops. So that changed the entire outlook of everything. And the fact that Burnside not only got up to Relay first, he secured it. That meant that it would be virtually impossible for Confederates to continue to ship arms down to Baltimore because they had to go through Relay too. That Relay station was crucially important. And so securing that meant strategically that they put the Union troops in a great position. Now, what did it do to the state legislature? Well, the state legislators had to understand that the northern people were infuriated not only with Fort Sumter, but with Baltimore's riotous response and not in abandoning the United States Capitol, the secessionists. So they, I think, probably began to fear the worst for their state. They don't really talk about that. I look a lot of things that were written. I look for instances where people, secessionists, would recognize that, but I have not found it. I looked and looked. The secessionists, the true hardcore secessionists, wanted to push through secession at Frederick, Maryland on April 26th, April 25th and 26th, or 26th and 27th. The governor called a meeting, they all got there. They growled about the cold on the north, the bold troops to sacred soil of Maryland. But they claimed that they didn't have the power to secede. So all those months and months of demanding that we have our secession convention, they all of a sudden came to a screeching halt. Said, "Oh, all right, we don't have the power. We don't have the authority to secede Maryland, the state of Maryland, from the Union without public approval." And so, where they complained and complained, but somehow they didn't all of a sudden seem to have the power to do what they wanted to do. Now, I think we have to read a little between the lines here to get a reasonable, realistic view of what was really going on. I have to think that, and there's one person who did a great job, crucial moment. And I have something that he said I wanted. Oh. John Pendleton Kennedy. What? The third page. From Maryland Middle Temperament. And I have to say, that book, Maryland and Middle Temperament by Robert Gruber, is a great book. I put together a busy honor. Trina,
It's the last page
yeah.
of the packet.
This is part of the bibliography, but it is a great book. It's not just about the Civil War. It's about the beginning of Maryland all the way up to 1980. And I think it's readily accepted by Maryland State Historical Society, and it is a fabulous book. But it talks about the influence that John Pendleton Kennedy, who was he was an attorney, Baltimorean for many years, a legislator, and part of the unionist business class that was developing Baltimore and points north and the railroad into a large industrial powerhouse. He had a mature look. He strongly urged Maryland against secession. The Confederacy, he said, claimed the free trade policy, but that would ruin the manufacturers of Maryland. Direct Confederate taxes on populous Maryland would multiply its existing tax burden much as 12 times. And importantly, Maryland would be vulnerable to a blockade by the Northern Navy. Now, it wasn't much of a navy, but it controlled Fortress Monroe. And that would have been a major problem for any, commerce coming up and down the Chesapeake from Baltimore right from the outset of the war. That Maryland had to, decide on its own course and realize that its future lay not with the stagnant state Eastern Virginia, but with growing Western, which was the 33 counties that refused to join the Confederacy. they did it for an economic reason too. They weren't tied to slavery, they were tied to the industries and commerce that the P&O Railroad brought to them from Baltimore out to the Ohio River. And he also noted the vulnerability, the defensible, non-defensible northern frontier of Maryland was an easy mark for troops from anywhere and everywhere. So apparently, his appeal had an impact not only on the legislatures but on the popular will, because many of the pamphlets were printed and distributed throughout Baltimore and elsewhere. But it was in the newspapers and it was I think it was probably more than anything a warning, just a sober warning. And I think it impacted a lot of secessionists who weren't completely, totally, committed to secession. And I
Get up in the wall.
right. I mean, now, and essentially what happened was that these secessionists realized that one thing very important, I didn't mention it. Here it is right here. Colonel McHenry Howard, CSA, wrote a book about his experiences after the war. I found it on page 411 that he wrote, I happen to have some personal knowledge that after the collision in Baltimore of April 19th, Southern leaders from across the Potomac sent messages that the Confederate forces were not sufficiently organized to come over into Maryland, that any rising in the state would precipitate aggressive action on the part of the South before it was ready. So we can't help it. And that the sympathies of Maryland would best be serve the Confederate cause by patience and quiet. And, he wasn't apologizing. He was just, his brother was Howard, the secessionist newspaper editor. And his father was on the police board. So these were Confederates all the way. And essentially, this is evidence that not only were these secessionists aware that Maryland, that Virginia couldn't help them right away when they needed it the most, that they would be causing their own immediate destruction.
Yeah. Yeah, so let's wait for a while till we do anything.
Yeah, just hold off, guys. Don't worry. Well, and that's part of the exigencies of war and of conflict, of armed conflict. You can't, all of a sudden, you can't just talk about it anymore. You have to do something about it. And when they realized that there was nothing that they could really do to defend their state, their whole economy and infrastructure, they found that, oops, we don't have the power to succeed.
Okay.
I think that's what happened. I think that's why the legislature was wise enough not to push themselves over
They might be hoping if they let it go for a while, things would change.
Right. And so what was the result? The result was that after the riots, when things quieted down, and there was and the Union troops stopped coming through Baltimore, what happened was, oh, wait a second, they burned the bridges north of town. But now the railroads can't bring in the supplies. They can't bring in the coal. They can't bring in the food that fed and warmed Baltimore. And so there was a spike. There was instant price gouging and everything. What? They had to rebuild the bridges right away because it was hurting, seriously hurting the people who lived in Maryland and the businesses who were shipping all this stuff through the port, out of the port. They couldn't do without this stuff. They were hurting themselves by burning their bridges to keep the Union out, keep the Union troops out. So they quickly did everything they could to rebuild the bridges and save Baltimore themselves. And that was part of the incredible ironies that these people in the Baltimore area, in the state of Maryland, lived through. Once the war happened, there was no longer a time for talking. It was a time for doing. And they found that they weren't going to get help. They got armed, they got guns. What they did, this is the problem I have with secessionists in Baltimore at the time, and in Maryland, in the state of Maryland. They attempted, some of them left for Virginia. You know, some of those militiamen, you know, were ready to go. They made it easily across the Potomac and started down the valley, down to join up with Confederate forces, and tried to get themselves eventually together as Marylanders in the Confederate Army. And they, to one extent or other, they did. But essentially, that group left. But the people like Howard, the editor, and other politicians, Severin Wallace, Morgan Scott, they didn't join the Confederate Army. They were the fifth column in Baltimore, in Maryland, advising and working with the Confederate leadership to join in and to push for secession as soon as it was feasible to get help from Virginia. General Lee, by that time, had just taken over and in charge of all of the armies of the state of Virginia. The Southern Confederate government had not the Richmond from Montgomery, Alabama yet. So Governor Letcher and Lee were basically in charge. Lee was very reticent about doing anything offensive. Lee's whole concept throughout the entire war, you read into it, look for this filter, is defending Virginia. Lee understood that Virginia was coerced into this by he resented it. I think that he was using them during 1862 to defend Virginia against the North. But I think he had it in. I think he was, didn't see himself as a hardcore Confederate nationalist. That's why he didn't want to share any of his troops with the armies of the West during the crucial points in the war where it might have helped win the Western theater. But so basically, we had the legislature say up. They don't have the authorities to see it, but we also had those elements of the legislature that were working hard with the Confederate government to find the right time and place to get Maryland to finish off secession and join the Confederacy. That is what they did. Now, from my standpoint, all of my readings and everything that I've seen and heard for the last 25 years, especially living here now for 33 years, I've really gotten a great perspective, I think, on Maryland. I hold it against the secessionists because they, are seen as the heroes, the fighting to defend Maryland. That's the image. That's the lost cause image of the old line of Maryland, the old line families, the people who were going to defend the state against the hordes of coercion of Lincoln's administration. What I think they were doing, though, was endangering the state. They were endangering the lives and property of everyone in the state by making it completely vulnerable to Union retribution. Unionists, the Union people in the North were infuriated with Maryland they didn't have the advantage of understanding what was really going on that we have 150 years later. They just saw Maryland and Baltimore, killing Union troops who were going to simply defend Washington. And I can't give our Maryland secessionists the benefit of the doubt. I think that they were responsible for endangering the infrastructure and the lives and property of most of the state. And as a result, that's my contribution to undoing the image of the lost cause of Confederate heroics in the state of Maryland. I'm not saying that the soldiers who left weren't here doing their own minds, they were doing heroic things. God bless them. But concept of forcing the secession of Maryland, despite all of the disadvantages and all of the anger and retribution that would have befallen this state, that befell Virginia instead, would have been on their shoulders. And I think if we're trying to study and really understand what happened in 1861, we should understand that. You don't have to think anything you don't want. But I think that you should at least consider that as the most realistic understanding of the secession crisis in this state. Questions?
Well,
Comments? John?
It seems like a lot was focused on Baltimore and the western part, so that you've got the eastern shore. Were they going to be part of that whole back and forth, or was that more west?
The Eastern Shore was part of Maryland.
No, I know that.
Right. As a result, you have to go back, I think, and I go back to Dixon Preston's book. And that's where I realized that in February of 1861, the Eastern Shore, this county, voted to send a Unionist delegation to Baltimore to vote to stay in the Union. And the vote was 847 to 666. That would suggest that there were considerably more Unionists than secessionists at that moment. But yes.
Would the Confederate Army come up the eastern shore, or were they all focused on the west? Not.
Yeah, I think it seems to me that the Eastern Shore of Maryland was isolated from the war. And it was completely isolated from the war. And you know what? That has given good cover for the secessionists from this area. That has been good cover.
And
Because if they were the people on the Western Shore that got invaded every year for 3 years and suffered and had thousands upon thousands of their livestock taken, their farms, you'd have their rail fences used for firewood, and as a result, being paid with a little IOU. And here's what we took. Now go to Washington, get your government to pay for this. That's what they got, and that's why they're not so hot on the heroism of the Confederacy. It's fortunate that the Shore did not get ravaged.
and if you drive around out there and poke around at some of these farmlands, and there's some major buildings out there, they were doing great, and they had slaves, and they were just quietly going about their business, and nobody was bothering them, and they were all happy with it. Yeah.
And
it probably would have required a naval attack because it's surrounded by water.
well,
And so that probably would have been too expensive to come here for little benefit. But getting back to Baltimore, it's interesting when the Union took over Federal Hill, which is across the harbor from downtown Baltimore, and they built their fortifications, allegedly to protect the port. But I remember as a kid, those cannons were still there. They were all directed to downtown
Right.
Baltimore.
And that's another thing, I looked at that too. And here's my take on that. On May 13th, almost a month after the Baltimore riot, Burnside, not but took 500 of his troops and came in the middle of the night on a cold, stormy, rainy night, came into Baltimore and marched his troops up the Federal Hill and occupied.
Right.
And okay, that's what he did. He didn't tell anybody he was doing that. He didn't tell General Scott and Lincoln. Nobody knew that Baltimore did. He just did stuff like that. But there were allegedly how many thousand men defending Baltimore at that time? This was May 13th. Remember, Baltimore had all those thousands of militia ready to fight and defend Baltimore from the Union. And here were 500 guys. They may have been in the fort, but I don't think they would have lasted very long. If you had even 4,000 or 5,000 armed secessionists in Baltimore ready to fight, ready to defend Baltimore, 500 Union guys come in. I don't care what fort they were.
They had the high ground.
Well, they did, but they were also, very vulnerable. You also needed heating them as well. So my point is that you're right. They did aim the guns, and that's a little ironic as well, because, Lincoln gave that famous, infamous order, fire on them, bomb their cities. Although I looked at it, first, bomb their cities, my God, fall in before, he wasn't going to do that. He was huddled in the White House, worried to death about getting captured the next day. And he was giving orders, well, what guns were there to even fire at their cities? There were about 3 or 4 guns, 3 or 4, long cannon at Federal Hill. And again, like that guy, the secessionist threatened the commander a couple of days before the riot, saying, if you fire on this city, the only thing they'll only be able to recognize the buttons on your uniform, because there'll be nothing left. And that was a legitimate threat. And so I think that 500 men face an angry city, it would have, by firing, that wouldn't have it. I don't think it would have. I don't think that Butler's presence in Baltimore that soon after the riot had ended, I don't think that really made that much difference as far as securing Baltimore for the Union. What did make sense in securing Baltimore for the Union was control of Relay Station, because that kept the secessionists from being able to use the B&O to reinforce Baltimore in any meaningful way, food-wise, ammunition-wise, etc. So, yeah, again, you hear all this, Butler came in and he took over. From that moment on, Baltimore never had a chance to, yes, they did. I think they did. But that's part of the image. That's part of the lost cause image that I was, unless I felt I had a little bit of perspective, but until I realized what I'm really talking about here, to think that the whole Baltimore riot lasted 2 hours, and it really involved 200 men who got separated from the rest of the regiment. That's not a earth-shattering thing, and I think that practically nobody in the North really understood that. They only know that four soldiers were killed, 12 civilians were killed. It's a terrible thing that happened, and that there was an invasion of the Yankee troops in Maryland. Well, yeah, they were coming through Maryland to defend Washington. That was pretty clear. Those were the orders from the president. But it was interpreted and reinterpreted and twisted to say that they're just invading our houses. We have to protect our women and children from, from these Yankees. I think that's myth, largely. It's possible that anything could have happened. We don't know. But we know what did happen. And we didn't have that kind of violence against Marylanders from Union troops. But what we do know was there was plenty of violence against them by Confederate troops. And some of those Confederate armies that marched across the Potomac and invaded Maryland were Marylanders. Bradley Johnson and Harry Gilmore and all these guys were Marylanders invading Maryland and taking, as part of the army that was taking all those livestock, horses by the hundreds and cattle and sheep by the thousands from Pennsylvania as well as Maryland during 1862, 1863, and into 1864. They took enough livestock in 1863 to feed the Army of Northern Virginia for 3 months after the Battle of Gettysburg. They had whole groups of cavalry that were gathering livestock and taking horses and moving them, even as before the battle happened and after the battle was over. They were pushing as many of these livestock back across the Potomac on the ferries as they could. And I have to find the exact number. Somebody had a good number that came from some of the Confederate logistical people about how much livestock they were able to take during that campaign. It was a long campaign, 3 or 4 weeks in Pennsylvania and Maryland. And those people on the Western Shore suffered for it big time. Maybe there's a reason why in 1862, when the Marylanders, the Army of Northern Virginia decided if we should when we're going to cross the Potomac and invade Maryland, we should bring plenty of new Confederate uniforms for all the Marylanders who were going to get to join the Confederate Army. So they brought several thousand uniforms in Maryland, and they got 200.
Organized peripheral. They're trying to.
Somehow they knew.
Your time is up.
All right, well, I'm glad we're able to talk to you. That's where I'm fairly well intended. The next week we'll tell me about the show. I could go for 3 days.
That's why I was waving my arm.
So thank you again for being here, guys. Thank you for your questions. Thank you guys at home for coming and sitting with us. Thank you. Now,